Dirty jobs, war, bar brawls. It was a violent and smelly time for men in the Middle Ages. Definitely smelly. Which brings us to our list of the top 10 messed up things that men went through in the medieval ages. Let's go. Let's count it down. Let's do it. Number 10. Pressure to perform. In the Middle Ages, either partner in a marriage was entitled to coitus with their partner under any circumstances. It was called the marriage rite, and this applied to both men and women. Unless you were passionately in love with your partner and straight, this could be a nightmare. It was so sacred that you could even get it on in a church, and the priest would be like, "Yup, go for it." Failure to perform in the bedroom or anywhere was grounds for divorce, which was a huge deal at the time. Now, the first problem here is a lack of consent, but the biggest problem for men who weren't inclined to sleep with their wives was impotency. There was no sympathy for men in these circumstances. If a wife accused her husband of this, then the couple would have to undergo a bedroom trial, where a crowd of wise elders, mainly grandmothers, aunts and mothers, would watch the couple in their bedroom for 3 nights. If you were rich, this was even worse. These trials would be carried out in public in court. Yeah, that's right. The wife had to prove that the husband couldn't get it up in court. Now he could call on women of the night to prove his prowess if he was so inclined. But if it was proven that he couldn't, then the couple would be divorced. But the bottom line, the main point of marriage was to have children. And if there weren't any, then this failure was placed heavily on the man. Number 9. Beastly justice. I figured I would put a light-hearted one on this list. This actually made me laugh while I was researching it. Beastly justice was when animals had to go to court, and they were also put on trial, like a full trial. It's wild to look back at the time and the things they had to do for their kings and queens. But the fact that they also had to get up early and attend these courts, where a wild animal was taking the stand, actually happened in history. This would happen after an animal ran through town and attacked people, being confused as most animals are. But the townsfolk would actually believe that the devil was involved in this animal's scheme, as if these animals worked for the Big Red himself. In 1457, villagers in France had to deal with 6 pigs who ran wild and attacked locals, causing a lot of damage. Instead of just putting the animals down or setting them free away from the town, they took them to a real trial. There was a judge, a couple of prosecutors, 8 witnesses and a defense attorney for the pigs, which I gotta say, we should do a list just on that person alone. What a weird job. These pigs were hung from a gallows tree, and a knight had to formally hang the pigs after the trial was concluded. The 1400s were a wild time, Your Honour, due to my client being a pig. Number 8. A tanner. Even for a medieval peasant who never washed or cleaned themselves and literally lived in filth, this was a dirty job. Women were more commonly found in household chores as milkmaids, weavers, artisans and tenant farmers. This job may have fallen mostly to men, and it was a rough one, I'll tell you. Men would rather go to war than do this job. You had to get skins from a butcher, along with the grime that covered them, mostly manure and blood. Then, you had to trim the skins and get rid of all the hair. To do this, they had to let the hair follicles rot by sprinkling them with urine or soaking them in a wood ash and lime solution. Can you tell which one was cheaper? After that, they'd scrape off the hair and any remaining skin before washing it again in pigeon droppings or dog poo to remove the lime and make it softer and more flexible. You, or the craftsman, might use fermented barley or rye with stale beer or urine again as additives. This process could take up to 3 months, plus even longer due to additional rinsing and stretching, until the leather could be used. Leather was a crucial resource, so, though dirty, it was a really necessary job. But oh my god, no thank you. Number 7. Being a knight. Being a knight obviously sounds cool. They have the sword, the horse, the flowing hair. They're saving the damsel in distress, all that jazz you picture in your head. But it actually sucked being a knight, a lot. First of all, chainmail. You know, heavy chainmail alone is like £55, and that was underneath all of your armour. No way I could climb up on a horse wearing armour or chainmail. My knees would buckle. No thank you. Being a knight is something that starts when you're 7 years old as well. You would be given to a noble to learn from for 7 years, and then, at age 14, you would become a squire, a knight's intern. Not an ideal job to have when you're 14, but okay. But if you stick it out for just 7 more years, then you become a knight, and then you can get your chest blown off jousting. Neat. All that time just to get rocked by another bigger dude on a bigger horse. No, just no for me. Number 6. Death by anything, but mostly violence. Life in medieval times was considered basically brutal and short. If it wasn't the plague, it was a cold. If it wasn't disease, it was the weather. If it wasn't the weather, it was famine. If it wasn't famine, it was violence. Everywhere else, it was a damn miracle if you survived childhood. Literally block this time period from your mind. Between 1330 to 1479, men could expect to die 9 years sooner than their female counterparts. The reason was violence against men by other men. But the biggest factor that made especially men's lives so short was violence, as I mentioned. Think about it. It was men who were often called to war with only their farming tools. And if they were proper soldiers, they would have had more. But they were called off to do jobs that literally required them to kill or be killed. Homicide levels in medieval England were around 10 times higher than they are today. This isn't to say at all that women were excluded from this. They were mostly the victims of this violence. But there was a culture around men that expected them to take part in violence to the extreme. From drunken brawls to duels, to playful sword fights gone wrong. Torment. There was a lot going on. Male gangs were responsible for most of the mayhem, as they were bolstered with the need to prove themselves. Also, if you were about to get mugged in an alleyway and somebody wanted to fight you, which was very likely because everyone was on edge, it was good to have backup. Number 5. Rat catcher. As the name hints towards, rat catchers are one of the worst jobs you can have in and around a castle. An important role, of course, like being a fool or a literal walking, talking toilet, which I'll get into later. But there needs to be a chasseur to rats, a rat chaser. In those times, rats and mice were the leading sources of spreading disease. They didn't have city buses or people walking around throwing bottles, and with these castles being big and dark, they were probably full of rats. Black rats were a common household problem. Yuck. So in comes the well-respected rat catcher. These guys would sometimes try and use spells to get rid of rats. It wouldn't work really too well. But more often than not, that didn't work. So poison powders were the main trick of the trade. The most famous you've probably heard of is the Pied Piper. He visited Germany. He arrived in the small town. And rumour has it this guy used a flute to drive all the rats just into the river. He just does a musical performance and then exterminates all of your pests. If anything, he should be getting a bonus. But rather, the town insists they weren't even going to pay him, so he used his flute to make everybody just go away and leave the town forever. What an OG. He's like, you don't want to pay me? No sweat. Number 4. The Crusades. Just imagine this. Thick, heavy metal armour reflecting the heat from the sun back against you as you chug along the desert. Despite being in the Holy Land, this certainly sounds like hell. As I mentioned earlier, men were expected to go to war when called, even if they had no training or skill, and maybe only knew how to use a toothpick, but had no idea what a sword was. For many, it was a death sentence, and the first Crusades were particularly brutal. You weren't only being called to war because of honour, but you were being called to war because it was a religious thing. Getting there was awful in the first place. You might not even make the voyage. Then marches through the desert were long and hot, with soldiers constantly at odds with starvation, dehydration, disease, infection, the elements, and then, of course, a spontaneous attack from the enemy. So, exhausted, and suddenly you have to be fighting somebody to save your life. There are even stories of some of them boiling shoe leather to eat it because they had nothing else. And after what we know of tanning, many crusaders justified their suffering as part of the spiritual journey. So if you did fall ill to disease, you were just kind of left by the side of the road to die alone. Number 3. Groom of the stool. Nowadays, assistants grab your coffee for you. Maybe they answer some phone calls, keep the business running while you're off doing your other business stuff. Assistants are vital. The groom of the stool was quite vital when it came to the king. Created by King Henry VIII, the role was to assist the king's bowel movements. Yeah, you had just a box with you that you carried at all times. A little opening lid, smelled horrible, and you would literally follow the king until he needed to use it. Yeah, porta potties weren't a thing, and there's no way you're going to catch a king in the woods. In fact, you won't even catch a king wiping his own behind. That was also reserved for the groom of the stool. Lucky you. And this stool, you would have water, towels, a wash bowl, the whole setup. And you're probably thinking, which poor soul had to be stuck with this role? What must you have done to deserve such a punishment? Well, this is the job you wanted. Really, only sons of noblemen could take on this role. And in doing so, they also gained access to every room, tons of nice clothes, any bedchamber furnishings, and of course high pay. Yeah, I would say this is the quickest job on this list, but it's really not. Number 2, the executioner. A man named Franz Schmidt meticulously chronicled his life as an executioner in detail, and as you can guess, it's not a fun one. But there was a lot of humanity behind it too. He had to start practicing on pumpkins at first, then graduate to live animals, and then humans. Who would choose a role like this? Well, though legally the role wasn't hereditary, it pretty much was by expectation and blood. The job was passed from eldest son to eldest son, with other sons being trained to fill vacancies. Daughters of executioners married sons of executioners, so the position would continue. As most people saw this as a pretty undesirable profession, it was difficult to keep anyone at their post, so the job fell to the men who inherited the axe, as it were. Not legally, but it was this cycle of executioners that created something called executioner dynasties across Europe. The existence of these dynasties meant that men were trapped in this cycle of employment and had few other opportunities to work. It also meant you had a very lonely life, as people who associated with death weren't people anyone liked to hang around. And number 1, the Gong Farmer. The Gong Farmer, of course, we had to end on this one, as it's definitely the crappiest of the list. Medieval washrooms were just horrible. They're not really a thing. They didn't have the sanitation techniques that we have today. Stuff would often pile up within the castle walls, and over time it would smell worse and worse. You can only imagine the rat trapper would be around this area too, I'm assuming. So maybe they would see each other and fist bump, and be like, "Hey, our jobs suck nice, let's do it, get that bread." So these respected Gong farmers would come in and take the bad stuff away from the castle. They were crap commuters, essentially. These cesspits were usually at the bottom of the castle, the lowest level, because you know how gravity and things work. These guys would go in and dig through years of yuck, piles of it, just moving all day long, back and forth, out of the castle. They were paid well, really well, obviously. But a lot of these Gong farmers got sick. A good number of them just wouldn't come out of those pits. Pretty horrible, right? And on top of that, people didn't like talking to them. Their job wasn't cool like the guy who takes heads. Head and shoulders also didn't exist back then. They didn't smell the best. They were often just kind of. And they'd cross the street. It was sad, it was all bad. And that's been our list for today, folks.